The morning sun was shining on Dunar Park. Early autumn had arrived with its characteristic precision. The cool air, carrying the scent of dry leaves and distant chimney smoke, mingled with the laughter of children coming from the playground, where swings creaked rhythmically beneath the cloudless sky. It was a morning made for peace and slowness. August Hill moved with the grace of habit. He wore a pressed gray hoodie over his dark-colored pants. His silver hair was neatly tucked under a soft woolen hat. He was 73 years old. Beside him, Langston, tethered by a 7-year-old leather leash, was striding along. The German shepherd moved with an alert calm. He wasn't pulling on the leash or fidgeting, sniffing every patch of grass or chasing after runners. He simply matched his owner's pace, ears pricked, tail loose but confident. He was the kind of dog that stood out even when still. Langston was August's best friend. He accompanied him under all circumstances. Ever since August retired from the federal bench, they had walked this path nearly every day. The park used to be a bit wild, a bit neglected, filled mostly with locals who recognized each other by name or with a nod. Back then, August could sit on the same worn-out bench for an hour without anyone noticing, sharing stories with old friends who had lived through the ups and downs, the hopes and disappointments, and the long, slow flow of change. But now the benches had been replaced with elegant wrought iron ones, and small plaques identifying the tree species had been attached to the trees. There were bike paths, dog waste stations, and a processional coffee stand on the northern lawn. August had watched young couples pass by, referring to the place as Linden Grove, the name real estate brochures had begun using for the area once new apartment buildings were constructed just beyond the tree line. Nothing remained of the park's former self. As much as this saddened August, he had to get used to its current state. As always, he had adapted. But he had noticed the change. The old neighbors had vanished, and the new ones arrived with their strollers, wireless headphones, and an instinctive fear of anything that didn't resemble them. What changes have you noticed in your own neighborhood? Things that used to be so warm and natural but have since shifted. As he rounded the bend next to the playground, Langston's ears perked up. A plump, bold squirrel darted across the grass toward a nearby black walnut tree. Langston's head snapped sharply to the side, his body tensed with interest, and he let out a single sharp bark. August looked down and gently adjusted the leash. Langston calmed down immediately. He always obeyed August. But on the other side of the grass, a woman sitting on a bench reacted as if a fuse had been lit. Maureen Tillman pulled her son, who was about 5 or 6 years old, tightly against her, shielding him with an arm that trembled visibly. Her eyes locked onto the dog, then onto August, and stayed there for a very long time. She saw Langston as a threat to her son. But what she didn't know was that Langston was a trained dog. August responded with a nod, a small, polite, calm greeting. The kind that says, leashed, trained, you're safe. Maureen didn't respond. She didn't even blink. Her lips tightened, and her hand went to her bag. Langston lowered his head again, this time sensing something else. Not a threat, but tension. August kept walking, his face unreadable, but the morning's atmosphere had shifted. It felt as though something was about to happen. Behind them, Maureen suddenly stood up, took her son's hand, never taking her eyes off him. With her other hand, she pulled out her phone. August heard the whisper, soft, urgent, but didn't turn around. He'd heard that tone of voice before. He'd seen that look before. In courtrooms, during depositions. He'd seen it in the careful language people used when searching for a plausible denial for what they were about to do. It was a look he knew all too well. Despite everything, he kept walking. But he was absolutely certain something was about to happen. Maureen's voice was low but tense with urgency when the operator answered. "I need to report a dog attack," she said. In reality, there was no such incident. She just wanted to get rid of him because he was bothering her. And she could lie about it very easily. There was a brief pause. On the other end of the line, there was a professional calm. "Ma'am, is anyone injured?" he asked. "No, but it just happened." A large German shepherd barked and tried to attack. "Yes, near the playground," she said, her breathing quickening. "It's aggressive. It's scaring the children." She kept insisting, saying it might bite someone. The operator, trained to detect tension, noted her tone as anxious yet resolute. The faint echo of a nearby child's giggle drifted in the background, but it wasn't perceived as contradictory. The call was logged in the system as a priority response. 2 units were dispatched. The phrase "threatening behavior toward young children" was flashing on the terminal. Maureen stayed on the line, her eyes still following August as he slowly walked away from the path. She provided the description. Elderly black woman, gray hooded sweatshirt, cane, large dog. There was just the right amount of concern in her voice. It had been carefully crafted. It was as if she'd been telling professional lies for years. When the dispatcher confirmed the units were on their way, Maureen quietly thanked him and ended the call. She sat back down on the bench, pulled her son into her lap, and waited. She was very sure of herself. What would you do if something like this happened to you? August continued walking without realizing it. His eyes drifted to the row of houses just beyond the eastern fence. Houses that had once been single-family bungalows, now transformed into glassy modern blocks with meticulously manicured lawns and black steel doors. He looked around, oblivious to everything. He remembered the days before that fence, the days when children would jump over the fence as a test of courage, when bicycles would rumble across the lawns without anyone complaining. He remembered sitting on the porch with Mrs. Clara's lemonade, watching the whole neighborhood grow, age, and change without permission. Everything had changed so much, and she thought that everything used to be more beautiful. Langston caught a new scent and lifted his nose but didn't follow it. His training had become second nature. August adjusted the leash's grip by moving his wrist slightly and murmured something under his breath, something gentle, reassuring. 2 blocks away, a police car pulled into a side street and stopped at the curb. Inside, Officer Brent Kowalsski sat upright, tapping his knuckles on the steering wheel as the report came over the radio. He grumbled. "Dog report," he muttered, more to himself than to his partner. Officer Shah Rocker looked up from his tablet, furrowing his brow. "An aggressive dog near the kids. Maybe it's nothing," he said. Kowalski snorted. "It could be something," he replied. He pulled the gear shift and opened the door in a single fluid motion. His hand instinctively went to his belt, checking his gear, radio, handcuffs, holster. Everything was where it should be. They'd be ready to intervene at a moment's notice. Rocker followed him more slowly, scanning the park as they approached. Morning joggers. A couple walking hand in hand, children at the playground. Everything looked normal. There was none of the panic described on the phone. "Central, near the East Road," Kowalski said, already striding forward with determined steps. They rounded the corner and spotted her immediately. An elderly black woman, a gray hooded sweatshirt, a cane. She had a large German shepherd on a leash. Kowalski's jaw tightened. "That's her," he said in a flat tone. Rocker hesitated. "She's just walking, Brent," he replied. "The dog looks calm." Rocker's instincts were right. There was no sign of trouble. "Headquarters said she's aggressive, that she's threatening the kids," Kowalski replied. "I don't see it," Rocker said again. He was trying to stay calm and professional. "Let's make contact," Kowalski said. Then his hand went to his holster. He didn't draw his gun. He just placed his hand there. He was ready. They approached from behind. Their boots crunched on the gravel. August heard their voices before he saw them. Decisive steps. The weight of authority in their footsteps. Everything was going exactly as they wanted. There was just one thing they didn't know, and that was who August really was. That was precisely why they were about to make an irreversible mistake. He stopped and turned slowly. Langston stood beside him, ears pricked, alert but not tense. "Ma'am," Kowalski called out, his voice sharp. "I'm warning you to stay right there." August's expression didn't change. She'd been addressed by law enforcement countless times, in courtrooms, in offices, in formal settings where respect was expected. But this tone was different. August had already sensed from the tone that something was about to happen. This was the tone used with suspects. "Good morning, officers," he said in a calm voice. "Is there a problem?" August asked. "We received a report of an aggressive dog threatening people near the playground. Is this your dog?" one of the officers asked. August looked at Langston, who was sitting calmly beside him, his tongue hanging slightly, his eyes bright. "This is Langston. He's on a leash and under control. We were just taking our morning walk," he replied. "Ma'am, we received a report," one of the officers repeated. "I heard what you said," August replied. Her voice remained steady. "But as you can see, my dog isn't aggressive. He barked once when he saw a squirrel. That's all," she explained. Despite everything, she felt a sense of unease. Kowalski narrowed his eyes. "The person who reported it didn't say that," he replied. "Then the person who reported it must have been mistaken," August said. A silence fell between them. Rocker shifted uneasily and looked at Langston, who stood completely still. "Ma'am, while we're verifying this, you'll need to leash the dog," Kowalski said. "It's on a leash, collared, trained, and poses no threat to anyone," August replied. But this answer seemed to leave Kowalski unsatisfied. Kowalski's hand tightened on his hilt. "Ma'am, I'm not asking," he said. "And I'm not resisting. I'm simply explaining that this stop has no basis." August's tone carried the weight of decades of judicial experience. Calm, decisive, unwavering. This produced the exact opposite of the effect he intended. Kowalski took a step forward. "Ma'am, I need to see your ID." "Of course." August slowly reached into her pocket. "My ID." Langston shifted his weight. His ears twitched at the sudden movement. "The dog is moving," Kowalski shouted, his hand going to his gun. August began, but his words were cut off as Kowalski drew his service pistol in a single fluid motion. "Secure the dog, now." Rucker's eyes widened. "Brent, wait." But Kowalski had already started shouting. He'd raised his gun, adjusted his stance, and was now aiming at Langston, who was still sitting calmly beside August. "Ma'am, step away from the animal." August's voice rose from the chaos with judicial authority. "Officer, my dog is not a threat. Lower your weapon." Stay away from the dog. Langston stood up, sensing the tension rising. Not aggressively, not to lunge. He was simply standing there, just as any dog would do when tension rises around its owner. The gunshot ripped through the morning air like a thunderclap, splitting the calm sky. Then silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. Langston collapsed onto the sidewalk, his blood forming a dark stain on the gray concrete. His body twitched once, then went still. August's cane fell to the ground. He knelt beside him, his hands trembling as they rested on the dog's body. He couldn't comprehend what had just happened. "Langston," he whispered. "Langston." No, his hands pressed against Langston's side, trying to stem the unstoppable bleeding. His amber eyes stared into the void. The light had long since faded. "Langston, please." Rooker froze, his face pale. "Brent, what the hell?" Kowalski holstered his gun with trembling hands. "The dog was aggressive. You saw it too. It was aggressive. He was sitting." He stood up. Right. He was sitting. August's world had shrunk to the weight in his hands. The warmth fading from Langston's body. The silence that reigned where there should have been breathing. He didn't lift his head. He didn't speak. He just pressed his forehead against the dog's fur and held him. Kowalski's radio crackled. Headquarters was requesting a status report. With trembling hands, he lifted the radio. Fire was opened. "The animal has been neutralized. No injuries to civilians or officers. The animal has been neutralized." The words hung in the air like ash. Rucker finally moved and knelt beside August. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry. Don't touch him." August's voice was barely audible. "Don't touch him." Kowalski stepped closer and reached for the notebook. "Ma'am, I need to see that ID now." August didn't move. She didn't notice him. Her hands remained on Langston's motionless body. "Ma'am, tell me." "My name," he said quietly, choosing each word carefully, "is August Hill." Kowalski paused, his pen suspended in the air. "And your address?" "And until 4 years ago, I served as a law clerk on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit." The pen stopped. Kowalski's face relaxed. "What?" August finally raised his head. His red but dry eyes met hers with the same calm certainty he'd used when issuing rulings that set precedents across 3 states. "Just now, you shot and killed a retired federal judge's pet in broad daylight, without cause, without justification, and without legal authority." Rucker's face went pale. "Oh my God." Kowalski's mouth opened. It closed. No sound came out. August's gaze did not waver. "I suggest you call your supervisor. Right now." For the first time in his 15-year career, Officer Brent Kowalsski understood what it meant when people said a person's life could change in an instant, because his had just changed. And this woman, kneeling on the sidewalk with blood on her hands and sorrow in her eyes, possessed the legal knowledge, institutional credibility, and absolute moral authority to ensure everyone knew exactly what she had done. Behind them, Moore and Tillman stood by the bench, phone still in hand, watching the unfolding events with an expression that was neither shock nor satisfaction. There was the quiet certainty of someone who had just made a phone call and received exactly the response they'd expected. August bowed his head toward Langston's motionless body. The morning sun continued to filter through the trees, the children's laughter still echoed from the playground. And in the space between one breath and the next, justice, patient, deliberate, unstoppable, began to gather itself around what had just been taken from it. Not revenge, not anger. Just a slow, inevitable certainty that power, unaccountable, would eventually face the consequences. And August Hill had spent 40 years learning how to make those consequences meaningful. The house fell silent, as old houses do. Every creak and groan was familiar, but now they carried for her. August sat in the wingback chair by the window, the afternoon light spilling into his lap, illuminating the aimlessly drifting dust motes. His hands rested on the armrests, his fingers tracing the worn fabric where Langston used to rest his head when he wanted attention. The empty dog bed in the corner might as well have been a crater. 3 days had passed since the shooting. 3 days he hadn't spent answering the phones he ignored, dealing with the reporters he brushed off, or reading the police department's official statements. Her neighbors had left flowers on the porch, mostly chrysanthemums, along with a few handwritten notes expressing shock and condolences. She hadn't brought them inside because she wanted them, but because letting them wither away felt like abandoning something that deserved better. Langston's leash lay on the side table, a small brass tag, its surface now smooth, engraved with his name and phone number. He'd taken it off before they, the animal control officers with their vans, notepads, and professional detachment arrived. Routine removal of a deceased animal, they'd said, as if Langston were routine, as if all of this were routine. August pressed his palm against the collar, feeling the warmth of sunlight trapped in the metal. He had cried once, the night it happened, sitting alone in this chair, allowing himself a full hour to feel the grief he'd spent a lifetime learning to control. Then he stopped, not because his pain had subsided, but because he had long ago learned that tears were a currency he could not afford to squander carelessly. Grief could wait. The documents came first. He had already compiled his notes, timestamps, the eyewitness observations he'd made before suppressing the sensitivity of his emotions, the name of the woman who called Maureen Tillman, which he'd learned from the incident report handed over by a young officer who looked very distressed, the exact phrases Kowalsski had used, Rocker's position during the encounter, the seconds between Langston standing up and the gunshot being heard. All of it had been organized with the methodical precision of someone who had spent 40 years building cases that the opposing counsel in their sleeker suits and with deeper pockets could not refute. The phone vibrated, again. After the first 12 calls from local news outlets and defense organizations offering unsolicited support, he had stopped checking. But this time the name on the screen made him pause. Daria Whitfield. August recognized the name immediately. A civil rights attorney, with a formidable reputation. Years ago she had served as defense counsel in cases August presided over. She was always prepared, always meticulous, and never wasted the court's time with theatrical gestures. On the fourth ring, he answered the phone. "This is August Hill. Judge Hill." There was a warmth wrapped in professional respect in her voice. "My name is Daria Whitfield. I know you don't know me personally, but I've been following your career for years. I called because I want to help." August gripped the phone tighter. "Thank you for your offer, Ms. Whitfield, but I haven't decided yet. You're going to file a lawsuit." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, spoken with the confidence of someone who understood how grief transforms into action in people who've spent their careers holding others accountable. "The only question is whether you want to do this alone, or with someone who specializes in exactly this kind of abuse." A silence stretched between them, not an uncomfortable one, a contemplative one. "Why do you think I need help?" August asked quietly. "Because you're a federal judge, which means you know the law better than most lawyers ever will. But you're also in mourning, which means that in every case summary you write, every deposition you attend, every cross-examination you face, while you're trying to appear rational because you're grieving the death of the defense attorney's dog, you'll be forced to relive the worst moment." Daria paused to let her words sink in. "I can carry that burden for you. Not in your place, but with you." August's eyes drifted to the empty dog bed. "I'd like to meet," he said finally. "Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. My address. Got it. I'll be there." The call ended. August hung up the phone and turned his gaze back to the window. Outside, the neighborhood routine continued. Runners, dog walkers, parents pushing strollers. Life went on as if nothing fundamental had changed, but something had changed. He could feel something building in his chest. Not exactly anger, but something colder and more enduring. The kind of resolve that had carried him through hostile confirmation hearings and the death threats from defendants whose appeals he'd denied. A certainty that some wars are not a matter of choice. Tomorrow she would initiate the formal process. Tonight she would mourn. She reached for Langston's leash and pressed him against her chest. She allowed herself one more moment of pure grief before the machinery of justice began to turn. Just one more moment. Then she would become what the situation demanded. Not a grieving woman, but an institutional force with 40 years of legal expertise and nothing left to lose. Daria Whitfield arrived at exactly 10 o'clock, carrying a worn leather briefcase and dressed in a plain, yet competent navy suit. She was younger than August had expected, perhaps in her mid-40s, and had the sharp eyes of a good lawyer, always noting the details. They settled into August's living room. Morning light streamed in through the windows overlooking the street where everything had changed. "Before we begin," Daria said, pulling out a notebook, "I want to be clear about how this process will work. Filing a civil rights violation lawsuit against police officers is difficult even under the best circumstances. When the plaintiff is a retired federal judge, the situation becomes exponentially more complicated because the defense will argue that you need to know how to de-escalate tensions, that your legal background makes you less sympathetic, and that you're trying to intimidate officers doing their jobs." August's expression didn't change. "I'm aware of that." "Good, because they'll make this case ugly. They'll scrutinize every decision you've made to find patterns they can use as ammunition. They'll find defendants you've sentenced harshly and use their families to prove you lack mercy. They'll turn your competence into a liability. Let them try." Daria smiled slightly. "I was hoping you'd say that." She opened her bag and took out the preliminary documents. "I've already started laying out the framework. Use of excessive force. Violation of the protections provided by the Fourth Amendment against unreasonable searches. Seizure of property without due process. Emotional distress. Also, if we can prove that the department was aware of Kowalski's previous complaints and failed to address them, we can also investigate the city's liability." August leaned forward. Previous complaints. 3 of them. All were swept under the rug through internal review processes. 2 involved the use of force against black civilians during traffic stops. The 3rd involved threatening behavior toward a young man who questioned his authority. Daria's eyes hardened. The department swept these under the rug. Routine administrative closures. No disciplinary action. No retraining. Just a note in a file that has no impact on their job whatsoever. How did you get this information? I have sources who believe documents matter more than institutional protection. They'll testify if necessary, but we'll need to be strategic about when and how we use them. August processed this. A pattern was emerging. Not an isolated incident, but a systematic failure to address known issues. Exactly the kind of institutional negligence he'd been ruling on from the bench for years. What about the woman who filed the report? August asked. Morin Tillman? Daria shook her head. I'm looking into her. Nothing concrete so far, but her reaction seems rehearsed. I'm pulling records of 911 calls from her address to see if there's a pattern. They spent the next 2 hours reviewing the strategy, filing deadlines, discovery protocols, witness lists, media management. By noon, the groundwork was laid. As Daria was getting ready to leave, she paused at the door. There's one more thing. This case is going to draw attention, national attention. People will want to turn you into a symbol of the judicial authority, confronting police misconduct, of black women demanding accountability, of any narrative that fits their agenda. You need to decide now how much of yourself you're willing to give to that. August thought about it. I'm not interested in being a symbol. I'm interested in working to ensure what happened to Langston doesn't happen to someone else's pet or someone else's child. Then we're on the same page. After Daria left, August was left alone with the weight of her decision. There was no turning back now. The wheels had started turning. His phone vibrated with a news alert. He glanced at the screen. Retired federal judge files civil rights lawsuit against police department over dog shooting. The news had spread faster than he'd expected. Within a few hours, his phone was flooded with calls. Local news outlets, national media, advocacy groups, former colleagues offering support, and threats. Anonymous messages calling her brazen, accusing her of using her status as a weapon, perhaps implying that the police were justified in perceiving a threat. Ugly words wrapped in even uglier assumptions about who deserves protection and who doesn't. August deleted the rest without reading it after the first line. He'd received death threats before. These were just noise. What mattered was the reaction within the communities that truly understood what Langston's death meant. By evening, a memorial service had been held at Dunar Park. August hadn't attended, but he watched the broadcast on local news. Hundreds of people, many with their own dogs, stood at the exact spot where Langston had died, holding candles in their hands. A young woman spoke into a reporter's microphone as tears streamed down her face. My dog is my family. If someone had killed him for no reason, I don't know what I'd do. Justice Hill is fighting for all of us. August turned off the TV. He wasn't fighting for symbols or causes. He was fighting because Langston was good, loyal, and innocent, and he had died in fear because someone in power had assumed the right to exact a price for a life. That was enough. On the other side of town, Officer Brent Kowalsski sat in the office of the police union's attorney, listening to explanations he didn't fully understand and assurances that sounded increasingly hollow. The department has your back, said attorney Marcus Venn, leaning back in his expensive leather chair. This was a justified response to a perceived threat. The fact that the plaintiff is a retired judge does not alter the fundamental principles of officer safety protocols. Kowalski nodded, but his hands continued to tremble. 3 days had passed, yet he could still hear the gunshot, see the dog collapse to the ground, and feel that moment when he realized who August Hill and what he had just done. He's going to ruin me, he said quietly. Venn's face hardened. He'll try. Our job is to make sure that doesn't happen. We'll argue that you responded appropriately to a report of aggressive animal behavior. We'll show that the dog's movements created a reasonable perception of threat. We'll prove that the use of force was within department regulations. But the dog was just, as a civilian witness reported, the dog exhibited aggressive behavior. You intervened to protect public safety. That's the story. No deviations. Kowalski wanted to believe this. He wanted to accept this version, woven around him like armor. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw Langston sitting calmly beside August, and the dog's eyes. That wasn't aggression. It was a dog reacting to the shouting. But saying that out loud would mean admitting he'd made a mistake, and mistakes' consequences he wasn't ready to face. So he shook his head. He went along with the story. He signed the documents the union representative pushed across the table, and he tried not to think about the woman whose pain he had caused and whose expertise had turned her into a permanent rival. By the weekend, Chief Daniel Denning held a press conference. Standing before the microphones in full uniform, his face carefully neutral, he read the statements prepared by lawyers and public relations experts. The officer involved in this incident followed the established protocols for responding to reports of aggressive animal behavior. While we understand this is a difficult situation for all parties, Our preliminary investigation indicates that the officer's actions were consistent with public safety training and departmental guidelines. A reporter raised his hand. Chief Denning, the complainant is a retired federal judge with an exemplary record. Doesn't that lend additional credibility to her complaint? Denning's jaw tightened. Every complaint is taken seriously, regardless of who files it. However, Ms. Hill's professional background does not alter the facts of what occurred. Our officers respond to threats based on the information available at the time, not on retrospective legal analysis. But witnesses say the dog was on a leash and calm. Our investigation is ongoing. We won't be trying this case in the media. The press conference ended abruptly. August was watching from the living room. Daria sat beside him taking notes. "Hill," Daria said, with obvious disgust. "Not Judge Hill, not Magistrate Hill. A deliberate act of belittlement. I noticed. They'll fight a dirty war. I wasn't expecting anything else." Daria cast a look at her client that bordered on respect. "You've been preparing for this your entire career, haven't you?" "Not exactly this, but the moment when the institutions you serve decided to protect themselves rather than seek justice." August's gaze was fixed on the television screen where Denning's face had been just a few seconds earlier. "I've spent 40 years watching the powers that be protect themselves. I know every strategy, every diversion, every institutional defense mechanism designed to avoid accountability. The difference is, this time I won't sit on the sidelines hoping the system works. I'll force it to work. What if it doesn't work?" August's expression didn't change. "Then I'll tear it down piece by piece until everyone understands exactly how the system failed. I have the time, the resources, and the expertise. All they have is their bureaucracy and the assumption that I'll eventually give up." He looked directly at Daria. "I won't give up." Outside, the afternoon light painted the street in gold and shadow. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a dog barked. Happy, carefree, alive. August listened to the sound and felt the absence beside him like a physical wound. But wounds heal, and justice, patient and methodical, had already begun to take shape around what had been taken. Not revenge, not anger either, just a slow, inevitable certainty that power, unaccountable, would eventually face the consequences. And August Hill had 40 years of experience in making people feel the weight of those consequences. The deadline for filing a lawsuit had been set. The discovery process would begin in a few weeks. Then the trial would follow, and when that happened, every assumption, every policy, every institutional safeguard that had allowed Langston's death would be scrutinized under the harsh light of legal scrutiny. August didn't want revenge, but the law demanded accountability, and he had spent a lifetime ensuring the law got exactly what it demanded. Daria's office occupied the third floor of a converted brownstone in a neighborhood that was neither clearly a professional district nor a residential area. It was situated in a neighborhood that hadn't quite decided whether it was a business district or a residential area. Legal files arranged in a functional chaos that suggested a system beneath the disorder covered every available surface. Legal assistant Marcus Chen had spread the documents in neat rows across the conference table. Phone records, 911 call transcripts, property records, employment histories. August stood by the window, watching the morning traffic below, while Daria and Marcus reviewed their findings. 2 weeks had passed since the case was filed. Those 2 weeks had been spent on discovery requests, preliminary motions, and the gradual unearthing of corporate records that departments preferred to keep buried. "We found something," said Marcus, looking up from his laptop. "Moore & Tillman has called 911. August turned toward the window. 17, all reporting suspicious activity, aggressive dogs or threatening behavior in public spaces, all in neighborhoods undergoing gentrification, all targeting Black or Latino residents." He opened a map on his screen. "Do you see the pattern? The dots clustered along the fault lines where old neighborhoods intersected with new developments, where longtime residents crossed paths with the newly arrived wealthy, in places where demographic shifts have sparked tensions that some have weaponized." Daria leaned forward. "Did any of these calls result in police intervention?" 6 did. 3 resulted in arrests on charges of disturbing the peace. Charges later dropped. 2 resulted in fines for violating the leash law. 1, Marcus paused, his face darkening. 1 resulted in animal control seizing a pit bull from its owner after Tillman reported it as dangerous. The dog was euthanized before the owner could object to the seizure. Silence fell over the room like ice. "The owner?" August asked quietly. "A young Black man. He lived in public housing 3 blocks away from where Tillman's apartment complex was built. He filed a complaint claiming the seizure was a pretext, but the complaint was shelved during the administrative review." August gripped his cane tighter. "He's done this before, time and again, and he doesn't do it randomly. Every call coincides with community meetings regarding development projects, zoning changes, or property appraisals that would benefit new residents at the expense of current ones. Daria opened another document. Her husband, Derek Tillman, works for Meridian Development Group. For the past 6 years, they've been the primary developers of luxury apartments in neighborhoods undergoing redevelopment. This is where things get interesting. She highlighted a section of the financial records. Meridian Development is a major contributor to council member Eric Bell's campaign fund. Bell serves on the City Planning Commission, and Bell cast the deciding vote on 3 major zoning changes that paved the way for Meridian's projects. Marcus added, Bell also secured increased police patrols in those same neighborhoods under the guise of public safety initiatives. More patrols means more surveillance, which means more fines and leads to longtime residents feeling less welcome. This pattern was taking shape with ugly clarity. Not a random bias, but a systematic strategy, using police intervention to create crises that legitimize displacement. Moore and Tillman's 911 calls weren't panic. They were tactical. August processed this with the cool, analytical detachment he'd honed over decades of examining evidence. Can we prove coordination between Tillman and the development interests? Not directly, not yet. Daria pulled up the email logs. But there are exchanges discussing community engagement strategies and perception management. We also have minutes from neighborhood association meetings where Moore and Tillman specifically advocated for increased police presence to address quality of life concerns. What does that mean? Marcus asked. To make current residents so uncomfortable, they'll want to leave. August finished. Daria shook her head. We're moving toward a broader, systematic pattern of discrimination made possible by the city's complicity. The issue isn't just Kowalsski shooting Langston. The issue is the infrastructure that makes your presence in that park appear threatening to someone who's already primed to see you that way. August walked over to the table and examined the documents spread out on it. Maps, search records, financial records, property transfers, all pointed to a deliberate displacement carried out under the guise of public safety. How will we prove this? He asked. We'll obtain internal communications from the police department showing they intervened despite knowing Tillman's calls were problematic. We'll take statements from the officers who responded to his previous calls. We'll prove the department was aware of this situation and chose not to intervene. Marcus opened another file. And we can get help with this. Someone from within the department contacted me and said they have documents showing that the supervisors discussed Tillman's calls and decided to deem them legitimate despite knowing his history. A whistleblower. August raised his eyebrows, an officer fed up with the department turning a blind eye to discriminatory practices. They're willing to hand over the documents but want protection before they're recorded. Daria took a note. Set up a meeting, a secure location. Make sure they understand the risks. They spent the next 2 hours mapping out a strategy. Discovery requests to compel the production of internal emails, subpoenas for the Planning Commission records, statements from everyone in the chain from Tillman's call to Kowalski's response, statements from everyone in the chain. August's phone vibrated. A news alert. Federal civil rights investigation launched into police department practices. He lifted the screen. Did you know about this? Daria's smile was faint. I may have reached out to some friends at the Department of Justice. I shared our preliminary findings. I suggested they investigate whether there's a pattern of civil rights violations warranting an inquiry. You didn't mention this. I wanted to make sure they'd actually open an investigation before raising your hopes. But yes, federal authorities are now involved. This means the department can't hope to quietly settle your case and let the issue go away. They're facing a comprehensive review of their practices. August looked at his lawyer with newfound respect. You're more strategic than I thought. I learned by watching good judges. You don't just win the case in front of you. You shape the environment so the next case doesn't have to fight the same battles. Outside, the afternoon sun painted the street in sharp contrast. August thought of Langston, the young man whose dog had been seized, and all the other people driven from their neighborhoods by systems designed to push them away. His case was a personal matter, but it was turning into something much bigger. When are we going to call Tillman to testify? He asked. Next week. I've already filed the notice. I want to be there. Daria hesitated. August, it's not standard procedure for you to be present during the testimony of witnesses against you. I know what's standard. I'm telling you what I want. Moore and Tillman looked at me in that park and saw a problem that needed to be eliminated. I want him to look at me during that testimony and realize exactly what he set in motion. Daria thought about it, then nodded. I'll arrange it. The testimony took place in a conference room that smelled of burnt coffee and anxiety. Moore and Tillman arrived with her lawyer. She wore a practiced smile that couldn't quite hide the tension in her shoulders. She was dressed in expensive casual wear, designer jeans, a cashmere sweater, the outfit of someone exuding effortless wealth. His smile faltered when he saw August sitting next to Daria. "Miss Tillman," Daria began after the formalities were completed. "Please state your full name for the record." "Morin Elizabeth Tillman." "And are you the person who called 911 on the morning of October 30 to report an aggressive dog at Dunar Park?" "Yes." "Can you describe the observations that led you to believe the dog was aggressive?" Morin's attorney, Richard Voss, leaned forward. "Miss Tillman has already given a statement to the police. This is an evidence-gathering phase, Mr. Voss. Your client will answer questions under oath, or we will compel her to testify by court order. Which do you prefer?" Voss leaned back. Morin cleared his throat. The dog barked loudly and lunged toward the playground where the children were playing. "I felt they were in danger." Daria opened the park's security camera footage on her laptop and turned the screen toward Morin. "This is security camera footage from the playground. The timestamp shows the exact moment. Can you point out where the dog jumped?" On the screen, Langston was clearly seen sitting calmly next to August. A squirrel ran past them. Langston barked once, turned his head, but his body remained still. August gently tugged on the leash to steady him. Langston immediately calmed down. No jumping, no aggression. There was nothing that would justify an emergency response, even from a distance. Morin's face fell. "It looked different from where I was sitting." "Where were you sitting, Ms. Tillman?" "On the bench. The one over there, 30 meters away, in a spot with a clear line of sight. You can see in these images that there were no children near Ms. Hill or her dog. The nearest child was 70 feet away, visible in the top left corner, completely unconcerned." Silence. Daria continued, her tone steady and ruthless. "Ms. Tillman, how many times have you called 911 to report incidents in public areas over the past 4 years? Voss interjected. "What does that have to do with the case?" "To establish a pattern of behavior." "Ms. Tillman, I don't keep track of the number." 17 times. Is that correct?" Morin's jaw tightened. "If you say so." "And in how many of those cases was the person you reported black or Latino?" "I don't distinguish by race." "All 17. In every single call you made, you reported a black or Latino person exhibiting behavior you characterized as threatening or suspicious. Would you like to revise your statement that race doesn't matter?" Voss stood up. "This is harassment. This demonstrates an intent to engage in systematic discrimination." "Sit down, Mr. Voss." Daria didn't raise her voice, but authority radiated from every syllable. "Ms. Tillman, your husband works for Meridian Development Group, correct?" "Yes, a company that is the primary developer of luxury apartments in neighborhoods undergoing demographic transformation. My husband's work has nothing to do with that. Your husband's company has donated over $200,000 to Councilman Eric Bell's campaigns over the past 6 years. Councilman Bell sits on the City Planning Commission and voted to approve all of Meridian's major projects. Can you say that your family has profited financially from the changing character of certain neighborhoods?" Morin's composure cracked. "We live in those neighborhoods. We have a right to feel safe." "Safe from what, Ms. Tillman?" "From elderly women walking their leashed dogs in public parks? From aggressive animals. You stated that the dog attacked. The video shows that wasn't the case. You stated that the children were in danger. The video shows that wasn't the case. You called 911 and reported a threatening situation that objectively didn't exist. Why?" The room held its breath. Morin looked at August for the first time since the questioning began. What she saw there, a calm, judicial assessment, patient yet relentless, seemed to unsettle her more than Daria's questions. "I was worried," she said in a weak voice. "You were worried about a black woman using a public park that you'd decided belonged to people like you. Yes or no, Ms. Tillman?" Voss stood up again. "We're done here. This clearly, it's over when I say it's over." Daria's voice was as sharp as glass. "Your client made a false report that led to the death of an innocent animal and caused a citizen serious emotional distress. She did this as part of a pattern of using police intervention as a weapon to drive people of color out of neighborhoods undergoing gentrification. We have documents, we have evidence of this pattern, and we have her own words in 17 different 911 calls. So now you can answer the questions, or you can answer them before a jury that will hear the story of the young man whose dog was euthanized following your latest false report." Morin's face went pale. "I didn't know that you didn't know that your false report led to an animal being captured and killed. It wasn't wrong. The dog was aggressive. According to animal control records, the dog in question was a 9-year-old pit bull with up-to-date vaccinations that had never shown any aggression, and it was captured solely based on your report. Its owner, a 16-year-old boy named Marcus Williams, lost his beloved pet because you decided his presence in your neighborhood was unacceptable." Tears welled up in Morin's eyes. Not from sorrow, from panic. The kind of panic that comes when the walls close in and the consequences hit. "I need a break," she whispered. "Let's take a 15-minute break," Daria agreed. When they reconvened, Morin was calm but defeated. Her lawyer had clearly advised her to give as few answers as possible and avoid further incrimination, but it was too late. The transcript would reveal a pattern: intent, the systematic misuse of emergency services to target specific population groups. And more importantly, it would show that what August Hill had experienced was not an isolated incident, but a calculated strategy. After the questioning ended, August and Daria stood in the parking lot watching the Tillmans drive away in their expensive SUV. "He's scared," August said. "He should be. We're going to use his statement to expose Meridian Development's ties to municipal planning decisions. If there's coordination between private development interests and police deployment strategies, we'll bring it to light." August shook his head slowly. "This isn't about Langston anymore. It was never just about Langston. It was about the system that made his death possible." Daria looked at her client. "Are you ready for this? For this to become something bigger than a single case?" August thought of the young man who'd lost his dog. He thought of all the families displaced by development strategies that used the police as an enforcement mechanism. He thought of the systems that had left people who deserved better in the lurch for 40 years. "I've been ready my whole career," he said. "I just needed the right case." His phone vibrated. Marcus Chen. "I found it." The whistleblower spoke. "There are internal emails showing that Chief Denning was briefed on Tillman's search pattern and, despite knowing the reports might be exaggerated, ordered patrol supervisors to respond by giving these reports high priority. Send everything to Daria immediately." "I already did." August ended the call and looked at his lawyer. "The chief knew. Then the chief goes down with everyone else." They stood under the afternoon sun, which cast everything in sharp contrast. There was no shade to hide in, no ambiguity to exploit. There was only evidence, meticulously compiled, pointing to a corporate failure so extensive it demanded a corporate reckoning. Justice had been patient, but patience had its limits, and August Hill had just reached his. The federal courthouse occupied an entire city block. Granite and glass rose with the deliberate authority of institutions whose architecture alone commanded respect. The morning sun struck the building's facade, illuminating the words carved above the entrance: "Equal justice under the law." August had passed through those doors hundreds of times throughout his career, but never as a plaintiff, never bearing the weight of personal loss rather than professional duty. Daria met him at the security checkpoint, briefcase in hand, a serious expression on her face. "There's a media frenzy outside. 17 news vehicles. They're treating this like a referendum on police accountability." "That's right," August replied simply. They passed through security and made their way to courtroom 6, a place August knew well. He had defended a case before Patricia Holloway twice, and had been successful both times. Holloway was fair, meticulous, and completely intolerant of grandstanding. She was exactly the kind of judge you'd want in cases where evidence matters more than performance. The gallery was packed. Community members, civil rights advocates, former colleagues who'd come to show their support. In the back rows, police union representatives watched with expressions that were a mix of hostility and barely concealed anxiety. Officer Brent Kowalsski sat at the defense table among his attorneys. He had lost weight since the shootout. His face was tense, and his eyes bore the distinctive weariness of someone who hadn't slept well. When August entered, his gaze drifted toward him, then looked away. He couldn't make eye contact. Chief Daniel Denning was sitting 2 rows behind the defense. His arms were crossed, his jaw clenched. Beside him, Councilman Eric Bell wore an expensive suit and tried to appear neutral, but his presence made it clear who found this case threatening. Judge Holloway entered the courtroom at exactly 9 o'clock. "Everyone rise." The formalities proceeded with a familiar rhythm. The opening statements had been made yesterday. Today, witness testimony began. Daria called her first witness. The plaintiff calls Dr. Sarah Chen. A woman in her 40s stepped to the stand. Her professional attire and composed demeanor identified her as an expert witness. After taking the oath, Daria outlined her qualifications: a veterinary behaviorist who had been studying dog behavior for 15 years and frequently served as an expert in legal proceedings involving animal behavior assessments. "Dr. Chen, you reviewed the video footage of the incident in question, correct?" "Yes." "In your professional opinion, did the dog exhibit aggressive behavior?" "No." Daria projected the park's security camera footage onto the screens in the courtroom. "Please describe to the court what you observed." Dr. Chen used a laser pointer to highlight specific moments. "Here the dog barks once at a squirrel. This is a behavior related to hunting instincts, extremely common, not aggression. Notice the dog's body language: ears forward, tail in a natural position, fur not bristled, and it's not lunging forward. The owner gently corrects the dog, and the dog obeys immediately. This demonstrates excellent training and a strong dog-owner bond." He fast-forwarded the footage. When the police approach, the dog remains in a sitting position. Even if the officer raises his voice and draws his weapon, the dog simply stands up. It doesn't bare its teeth, doesn't growl, and doesn't step between its owner and the perceived threat. It stands up only because its owner is distressed. This is a protective behavior, not aggression. In your professional opinion, did this dog pose an immediate threat that would justify the use of lethal force? Absolutely not. This was a well-trained, leashed dog responding appropriately to warnings. Anyone with a basic understanding of dog behavior would have realized it posed no danger. Defense attorney Marcus Venn stood up for cross-examination. Dr. Chen, isn't it true that even trained dogs can become unpredictable under stress? Under extreme conditions, yes, but so an officer approaching a large German Shepherd couldn't be absolutely certain the dog wouldn't attack? If the officer had received any training in recognizing animal behavior, yes, he could have been absolutely certain. The dog's body language was very clear. But my client isn't a veterinary behaviorist. He's a police officer responding to a 911 call about an aggressive animal. In that case, perhaps police officers who regularly interact with civilians and their animals should receive basic training to distinguish between a real threat and normal behavior. A few members of the audience nodded. Judge Holloway took a note. Daria called her next witness. The plaintiff calls Officer James Rucker. Kowalski's former partner stepped up to the witness stand with obvious reluctance. He had been granted immunity in exchange for testifying truthfully. This agreement required him to acknowledge what he witnessed, even if it contradicted his department's position. Officer Rucker, were you there when Officer Kowalski fired his weapon? Yes. In the moments before the shot was fired, did you find the dog threatening? Rucker swallowed hard. No. Please explain. The dog was sitting. It had barked once earlier when it saw a squirrel, but it had calmed down by the time we approached Mrs. Hill. It was just sitting there. Did you tell Officer Kowalski that the use of deadly force wasn't necessary? He paused. I said, Brent, wait. But he had already drawn his gun. Why did you say that? Because I didn't see a threat. I saw an elderly woman with a leashed dog. There was nothing that warranted the situation escalating. But did Officer Kowalski escalate the situation anyway? Yes. Daria opened another document. Officer Rucker, you filed an incident report after firing your weapon. In that report, you stated that the dog exhibited aggressive behavior. Is that correct? Rucker's face paled. That's what I wrote. But you just said the dog was calm. My superior told me to align my report with Officer Kowalski's statement to ensure consistency. So did you lie in an official document at your superior's instruction? Yes. Whispers rose in the courtroom. Judge Holloway banged his gavel for silence. Daria continued. Who ordered you to falsify your report? Sergeant Michael Torrance. Well, Sergeant Torrance, did he explain why consistency is more important than the truth? He said the department couldn't afford internal contradictions in incidents involving the use of force. He said it would undermine public trust. So the truth was sacrificed for the sake of public relations? Venn objected. Your Honor, the attorney is making a statement. Objection overruled. The witness may answer. Rucker looked directly at August for the first time. Yes, the truth was sacrificed. And I went along with it because I was afraid of what would happen if I didn't. I'm not proud of it. This confession hung in the air like an irrevocable confession. Meanwhile, as August stood in the hallway, Daria was answering calls from reporters seeking comment. Through the windows she could see the street below where protesters had gathered. Some supported his case, while others carried signs defending the police officers. They're afraid, said a voice behind her. August turned. An elderly black man in a janitor's uniform nodded slightly. The ones with badges. They're afraid because you're showing them what accountability that can't be swept under the rug looks like. I'm just seeking justice for my dog. You're seeking justice for everyone whose lives are treated as if they don't matter, because those in power have decided they're the problem. This is a bigger issue than your dog, ma'am. That's why they're afraid. August walked away before he could respond. When the court reconvened, Daria called the witness everyone was expecting. The plaintiff calls Officer Brent Kowalsski. The defendant stepped to the stand. His hand trembled slightly as he took the oath. His attorneys had clearly prepared him thoroughly. Measured answers, no emotional outbursts. Stick to the narrative. Daria approached him calmly and meticulously. Officer Kowalski, how many years have you been serving in the police force? 15 years. And during those 15 years, how many incidents involving the use of force were you involved in? I'll need to check my records. 11. 3 of those led to formal complaints. Does that refresh your memory? Yes. How many of those 3 complaints were upheld? None were officially upheld, but the complaints were filed by civilians who believed your use of force was excessive. People always complain. 2 of these complaints involved black civilians during traffic stops. Is that correct? Kowalski's jaw tightened. Yes. And the 3rd one involved threatening behavior toward a young man who questioned your authority? The situations were more complicated than you think. Yes or no, Officer Kowalski? Yes. Daria was projecting internal emails onto the screens in the courtroom. These are communications from your superiors discussing your history of complaints. In this email, Sergeant Torrance writes, Kowalski's use of force is concerning, but it's difficult to address without clear policy violations. Additional training is recommended. Did you take that additional training? I don't remember. According to department records, you were scheduled to take de-escalation training 3 times over the course of 2 years. You didn't attend a single session. Why? It conflicted with my schedule. Schedule conflicts that lasted 2 years? Or did you simply not believe you needed de-escalation training? Silence. Officer Kowalski, what information were you given when you received the 911 call about an aggressive dog? Dispatch reported a large German Shepherd exhibiting aggressive behavior near children at the playground. Did dispatch provide a description of the dog's owner, an elderly black woman? So when you arrived at the park and saw Miss Hill, what did you see? A woman matching the description with a large dog. Did the dog appear aggressive to you? It was barking. The caller had said the dog was threatening the children. I didn't ask what the caller said. I asked what you observed. Did the dog appear aggressive? Kowalski hesitated. It was a large animal. German Shepherds can be dangerous. That's not what I asked. When you approached Mrs. Hill, was the dog exhibiting aggressive behavior? It was. It stood up when I approached. Is standing up aggressive behavior? In this context, yes or no, Officer Kowalski? Is a dog that stands up inherently aggressive? No. Did the dog bark at you? No. Did it growl? No. Did it lunge at you or bare its teeth? No. So a leash dog that wasn't barking, growling, or lunging, just standing by its owner, was that the threat you perceived? I was told it was aggressive. You were told that by someone standing 30 meters away, who later testified under oath that they had exaggerated the situation. But you didn't verify that. You didn't assess it. You drew your weapon on a calm leash dog that posed no threat and an elderly woman. Venn stood up. Objection, counsel. I withdraw it. Daria turned back to Kowalski. Why did you draw your weapon? Officer safety protocol. It allows for drawing a weapon when there's a reasonable perception of a threat. What aspect of this situation constituted a reasonable threat? Kowalski's composure cracked. The dog moved. The dog was standing still. After you shouted, after you drew your weapon, the dog reacted to your aggression, not the other way around. I perceived that. You perceived an elderly black woman with a dog as threatening because you were trained through explicit instructions or institutional culture to view black people in public spaces as inherently suspicious. Yes or no, Officer Kowalski? That's not true. Yes or no? The courtroom held its breath. Kowalski's voice cracked. I saw her and thought she was just another one of them. The words exploded like a grenade in the closed room. The air froze. A shocking silence. Even Judge Holloway's expression changed. A subtle yet clear look that he had realized an irrevocable confession had been made. What does just one of them mean, Officer Kowalski? Daria asked quietly. I didn't mean it that way. You saw a black woman in a public park and classified her as just one of them. What does one of them mean? Tears welled up in Kowalski's eyes. It wasn't exactly remorse. It was simply the horrifying realization that he had spoken the truth aloud in a setting where it would be recorded, preserved, and used against him forever. Someone who doesn't belong there, he whispered. Daria let the statement hang in the air, giving the jury time to fully absorb its weight. I have no further questions. Venn tried to damage control during cross-examination, but what had been said could not be erased. Kowalski had admitted not only to using excessive force but also to the underlying assumption, the assumption that August Hill's presence in a gentrified park was inherently problematic because of his race. When the court adjourned for the day, August sat in the gallery for a long time, while everyone else had already left. Daria gathered the documents in methodical silence, giving her client time to process the situation. He said it. August finally remarked, the thing everyone knows but acts as if it isn't true. He said it under oath in federal court. Yes. And there's no point in pretending anymore. No. Now there's only accountability. August stood up, took his coat and cane. Outside the sun was setting, painting the courthouse steps in gold and shadow. The media was waiting. Protesters were waiting. The machinery of public opinion was waiting to digest what had happened in that courtroom. But August wasn't thinking about any of that. He was thinking of Langston, of the moment he'd looked at him in disbelief before the bullet struck, of the trust betrayed not just by an individual officer, but by the systems that had made such betrayals routine. When will the jury reach a verdict, he asked. Closing arguments will be held tomorrow. Then the decision is up to them. How long do you think? Daria thought for a moment. With testimony like today's, it won't take long, Kowalski confessed. The department's cover-up is documented. The pattern is clear. Either they believe the evidence is significant, or they don't. August nodded slowly. Then let's wrap this up tomorrow. They stepped out into the evening air, which carried the first real chill of the approaching winter. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted their questions. Supporters offered words of encouragement. August paid no attention to any of it. He simply walked toward the waiting car, got in, and allowed himself to be driven home to the house where Langston's empty bed still waited, and would likely wait forever. But tomorrow the jury would decide whether his death held any meaning beyond grief. whether the time had finally come for institutions that had operated for far too long without a sense of accountability to face the music. Whether an elderly woman's refusal to accept injustice would force systems to acknowledge what they had denied for decades, not revenge, not anger. Only the slow, methodical application of the law to a government that assumes the law does not apply. And August Hill, who had perfected this application over 40 years, was about to find out whether justice still functioned when those who once administered it demanded justice for themselves. The car drove away from the courthouse. Behind them, the words carved into the granite still caught the fading light: equal justice under the law. Tomorrow, they would find out if those words truly held any meaning. After 4 hours of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. By most standards, it wasn't a long time, but in a case where weeks of testimony and years of institutional failure had come to light, those 4 hours felt as though they were being crushed under the weight of the decision to be made. August sat in the gallery next to Daria, his hands in his lap, maintaining the same calm he had throughout the trial. Yet his fingers were pressed so tightly together, they betrayed the tension he was carefully keeping in check. Around them, the courtroom was filled with the same faces that had occupied those seats for days: community members, advocates, former colleagues, and in the back rows, police union representatives whose expressions had shifted from hostile certainty to something bordering on horror. Officer Brent Kowalsski sat at the defense table, his face pale, his hands trembled despite his obvious efforts to control them. His attorneys stood on either side of him with a professional composure that could not fully hide their awareness that yesterday's testimony had shattered any remaining hope of acquittal. Chief Daniel Denning was sitting in his usual spot 2 rows behind the defense attorneys, but the confidence he had displayed the previous day had evaporated. The federal investigation triggered by Daria had now turned into a comprehensive review of departmental practices, and every day brought new subpoenas, new requests for documents, and new evidence of the systematic failures he had either enabled or turned a blind eye to. Councilman Eric Bell's absence was notable. The indictment regarding the conspiracy charges had been unsealed that morning. Federal prosecutors were moving with a precision that suggested coordination with the timeline of this case. The charges included an allegation of coordination to systematically displace minority residents through sanctions, using sanctions as a weapon to systematically displace minority residents. His boss had already switched sides and presented documents linking Meridian Development's donations to specific zoning decisions and patrol deployment strategies. Judge Patricia Holloway entered the courtroom. "Everyone rise." The formalities proceeded with a familiar rhythm, but beneath the procedural calm, attention hummed like an electric current waiting for the circuit to close. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreperson stood. She was a black woman in her 60s, who had taken notes throughout the testimony with the meticulous attention of someone who knew the details mattered. "We have, Your Honor. Please read the verdict." In the case of Hill v. Kowalski, regarding the charge of excessive use of force causing property damage, we find the defendant guilty, the first crack in the dam. On the charge of violating the protections afforded by the Fourth Amendment against unreasonable seizure, we find the defendant guilty. The water began to flow. On the charge of taking property without due process of law, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of intentionally inflicting emotional distress, we find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted in applause. Judge Holloway allowed the applause to continue for a few seconds before striking his gavel to restore order. It wasn't exactly a celebration. It was more like a collective exhalation from people who had held their breath for far too long. Kowalski's head dropped. His lawyers immediately began discussing an appeal, but a sense of defeat resonated beneath the formality of their voices. Furthermore, the foreman continued, and the courtroom fell silent again. "The jury has found, based on clear and convincing evidence, that the defendant's actions stemmed from racially motivated discriminatory intent and recommends $500,000 in punitive damages." This time, Judge Holloway allowed the applause to linger longer. The punitive damages indicated that the jury had not only found liability, but it also established malicious intent, a deliberate crime deserving of punishment beyond mere compensation. Daria leaned toward August. "We won, and by a landslide." August nodded slowly, but his expression remained measured. The verdict was significant, but what would determine whether Langston's death would bring about lasting change or merely a temporary reckoning was what would happen next. Judge Holloway addressed the parties. "The damages hearing will take place next month. The court thanks the jury for their service." He paused and looked directly at Kowalski. "The defendant is reminded that this decision lays the groundwork for criminal referral. The U.S. Attorney's Office has already indicated its intent to file a lawsuit alleging the deprivation of civil rights under the guise of the law. You should adjust your behavior accordingly." Kowalski's face went pale. Legal liability was one thing, Criminal prosecution, however, potentially meant a federal prison sentence. As the courtroom emptied, August remained seated. Chaos reigned around him. Journalists seeking comment, community members offering congratulations, former colleagues embracing him with the private emotions of people who had believed in the system throughout their careers and found relief in seeing it function occasionally. He graciously accepted their condolences, but his mind had already moved on to action. If he couldn't bring about structural change, the rulings meant nothing. The press conference took place on the courthouse steps under the afternoon sun, which cast everything in sharp contrast. Daria had wanted to carefully manage the messaging, but August was clear about what he wanted to say. Cameras took their fore. Reporters raised their microphones. The crowd that had gathered during the trial moved even closer to hear. August stood at the podium, with Daria by his side, and for the first time since Langston's death, he allowed himself to speak publicly about what had happened and what it meant. This decision represents accountability for a public official's actions, he began, his voice reflecting the same measured authority he used when explaining judicial rulings. But holding individuals accountable for their mistakes is not enough. What happened to Langston was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of systemic failures in education, oversight, and an institutional culture that allows discriminatory assumptions to operate as routine procedures. She paused for a moment to let the assessment sink in. The evidence presented during this hearing revealed coordination between private development interests and municipal enforcement strategies designed to displace minority residents from neighborhoods undergoing gentrification. This coordination included false 911 calls, preferential police intervention, and pretextual justifications deliberately fabricated for enforcement actions. This was not random. It was systematic. Behind him, community members nodded. They had lived through this reality. Now it was documented under oath in federal court. Langston was a good, loyal, and innocent man. He died because a person in power made an assumption that cost a life. But he was not the first victim of these practices, and unless meaningful reform is implemented, he will not be the last. He pulled papers from his jacket pocket. That is why I am announcing the establishment of the Langston Fund, a legal aid organization dedicated to providing representation to those facing discriminatory practices, exploitative zoning practices, and the abuse of institutional power. The fund will be financed by the compensation awarded in this ruling and supported by a coalition of civil rights organizations working to ensure that what happened to me does not happen to people who lack the resources to fight back. Daria had objected to making this announcement before the compensation was actually paid out, but August had overruled her. Momentum was crucial. The public commitment created accountability. We are also demanding comprehensive reform of police training protocols, mandatory reporting of discriminatory 911 calls, independent investigations of use of force incidents, and a ban on coordination between private development interests and municipal enforcement strategies. A reporter raised her hand. Judge Hill, do you believe Officer Kowalsski should face criminal charges? That is for prosecutors to determine. However, I believe federal civil rights laws exist precisely for situations like this, where a person in a position of state authority deprives another of their constitutional protections with discriminatory intent. The evidence is documented. The confession was recorded. If these laws have any meaning, they must be applied here. What about Chief Denning? Chief Denning oversaw a department where discriminatory practices were routine, internal complaints were suppressed, and officers like Kowalski operated with impunity despite a documented pattern of excessive force. Leadership either addresses systemic failure or becomes an accomplice to it. The chief had the information and chose institutional protection over accountability. This choice has consequences. Another reporter, Maureen Tillman, hasn't made a public statement since her testimony. Do you have a message for her? August's stance hasn't changed. Ms. Tillman used emergency services as a weapon to target people she deemed undesirable in her neighborhood. By making 17 false reports over 4 years, she contributed to the displacement of families and the death of at least one more animal. I hope she realizes that her own comfort does not justify others' suffering, and that 911 is for emergencies, not for managing her concerns about demographic change. The press conference lasted another 20 minutes, but August's message had been delivered. This wasn't just about winning a case. It was about forcing institutional accountability. When the cameras finally dispersed, Daria pulled August aside. You've pledged to fund an entire legal aid organization with unadjudicated damages. The jury awarded punitive damages. The damages hearing is a formality. We'll have the resources. What if the appeals process delays everything? Then I'll fund it myself initially and recoup it later. We can't wait for the appeals process to conclude. Daria looked at her client with a mix of anger and admiration. You're impossible. I'm determined. There's a difference. The aftermath unfolded as the kind of corporate chaos that occurs when sunlight finally reaches corners that have operated in comfortable darkness for far too long. Chief Daniel Denning resigned 48 hours after the decision was handed down. His departure was presented as retirement, but it was accompanied by federal agents executing search warrants at his home and office. Internal emails were damning: Kowalski's history of complaints, Tillman's search protocols, and the coordination between Councilmember Bell's office and patrol deployment strategies. He knew everything and had done nothing. He had prioritized the department's reputation over accountability. In his place came a black woman with a long history in community policing and a zero-tolerance stance toward the kind of practices that led to Langston's death. Maureen Tillman's social media accounts, once filled with skillfully staged photos of neighborhood improvement advocacy, were permanently shut down. Her neighborhood council position was eliminated. Her husband's company, Meridian Development, faced a federal investigation into whether their coordination with city officials constituted fraud or conspiracy. Several projects were put on hold until the investigation concluded. The young man whose dog was euthanized following Tillman's previous false report, Marcus Williams, now 19, reached out to August through Daria. They met at a cafe, and August listened to his story about how the system had taken his pet away based on the assumption that a black man owning a pit bull was dangerous. "I didn't have the resources to fight back," he said quietly. "No lawyer would take my case. They said it was impossible to prove the seizure was discriminatory." "It's not impossible," August replied. "It just requires documentation and the institutional will to hold them accountable. We have both of those right now." He told him about the Langston Fund. "We're hiring lawyers and legal assistants. If you'd like to help prevent what happened to you from happening to others, we'd welcome your participation." Marcus's eyes widened. "You want me to work for the fund? I want people who understand these issues from their own experience to help shape how we approach them. You've lived through exactly what we're fighting against. That's a very valuable perspective." 6 weeks later, Marcus Williams became the Langston Fund's first community liaison. He was responsible for connecting with people facing discriminatory practices and helping them access legal resources. Officer Brent Kowalsski was charged with a federal civil rights offense 3 months after the ruling. The U.S. Attorney's Office pursued the prosecution with meticulous preparation, demonstrating that they understood this case would set a precedent. Kowalski's attorneys negotiated a plea agreement. In exchange for the prosecution's offer of a reduced sentence, he would admit to violating civil rights under the guise of the law. He was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, 3 years of probation, and a permanent ban on working in law enforcement. It was not as severe a sentence as many had hoped, but it marked the first time in this judicial district's history that an officer had been sentenced to federal prison for using force against an animal. The sentencing hearing was brief. Kowalski read a prepared statement expressing remorse. Though the statement seemed memorized, it likely contained a sincere acknowledgement that his actions had ruined many lives, including his own. August attended the hearing but did not speak. He had said what needed to be said in court. The decision had been made. His sentence, though it seemed insufficient to some, demonstrated that the institution acknowledged the consequences of abuse of authority. That was enough. 8 months after Langston's death, August stood in the morning sun, watching children run about in the reading garden dedicated to his memory. The local elementary school had transformed an unused courtyard into a green space with benches, flower beds, and a mural depicting a German shepherd sitting calmly beside an elderly woman on a park bench. The artist had captured something as fundamental as friendship, not aggression or threat. The simple dignity of beings who have found one another and built a trust that should be inviolable. The school principal, a woman of Latin descent named Carmen Rodriguez, addressed the gathered children and community members. "This garden bears the name of Langston, who was loyal, good, and innocent. He represents all beings, people and animals, who deserve to exist in public spaces without fear or prejudice, without having to prove their right to exist. He represents all beings who deserve to exist without having to prove their right to exist." She turned to August. "Judge Hill, would you like to say something?" August tapped his cane lightly on the sidewalk as he slowly approached the microphone. The children looked at him with open curiosity, and for a moment he was transported back to the courtrooms where he made decisions that shaped their futures: custody cases, educational rights, juvenile justice reform. He had always tried to imagine the faces affected by his decisions. Now he was looking directly at them. "Langston was my friend," he began simply. "He'd go for a walk with me every morning. He'd sit by my side every evening. He didn't care that I was a judge or that I'd been making decisions that affected people's lives for 40 years. The only thing he cared about was that I loved him, and he loved me." He paused for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "When someone took him from me, they took something irreplaceable. But his death also brought to light something that needed to be revealed. That the systems we rely on to protect us can sometimes fail, that those in power can sometimes abuse it, and that assumptions about who belongs and who doesn't can lead to terrible consequences." The children listened with that special attention they show when adults speak to them as equals. This garden exists so that Langston is remembered not just for how he died, but for what his life represented: friendship, That simple goodness that emerges when beings treat one another with dignity. He looked at the mural, at the artist's depiction of the afternoon sun painting Langston's feathers gold, and his own rendered figure sitting beside him in perfect peace. I hope that when you use this space you remember that every being deserves the same dignity. Every person, every animal, everyone simply trying to live fearlessly in public spaces. A light round of applause, more a gesture of respect than celebration. The children were let loose to explore the garden. Their joy in the new space filled the air with laughter that Langston would have loved. Carmen then approached August. We're teaching the children about civil rights, activism, and how the courage of a single person can force institutions to change. Your cause is now part of our curriculum. August smiled faintly. I hope you're also teaching them that change requires documentation, strategy, and patience. Courage is important, but sensitivity is more important. We're teaching both. When the ceremony ended and the crowd dispersed, August remained in the garden, sitting on the bench depicted in the mural. It was an autumn afternoon, carrying the same light that had painted Dunar Park on that morning when everything changed. Yet here, in this space born of loss, something productive was taking root. The Langston Fund had settled its first 17 cases. 2 had been resolved through settlements in which police departments admitted to wrongful conduct. 5 more were heading to trial. The organization was hiring additional attorneys, expanding into 3 more cities, and was building infrastructure to systematically challenge discriminatory practices. Legislative reform was moving more slowly, but reforms always were. The city council had approved new oversight requirements for 911 call patterns. The state legislature was reviewing bills mandating independent investigations of use of force incidents and prohibiting coordination between zoning interests and enforcement strategies. None of this brought Langston back. But all of this meant that his death had produced something beyond grief, institutional accountability, that would ensure others could live, not revenge, not anger, just the slow, methodical application of the law against a government that assumes the law does not apply, and the 40 years of expertise that ensures this application creates lasting change. That evening, August sat in the living room, watching the sunset through the windows that looked out onto the street where he had walked with Langston every morning for 7 years. The collar was still sitting on the side table. The empty bed was still in the corner. He hadn't gotten another dog. He probably never would. Langston was a friend, not a replacement. But the house didn't feel as empty as it used to. It wasn't because the grief had lessened. It hadn't, and probably never would completely. But the emptiness that had been on the verge of swallowing her had been filled with a purpose. Her phone vibrated. Daria, the damages hearing is over. The judge awarded the full amount of compensatory damages, in addition to the punitive damages recommended by the jury. $500,000 in punitive damages, $300,000 in compensatory damages. The Langston Fund is fully funded. How long will Kowalski's appeal take? His lawyers filed notice this afternoon. The appeals process will take years. But in the meantime, the ruling stands, and the fund operates independently, regardless of whether he pays a single penny. Thanks to the precedent you set, we've already secured additional foundation support. August processed this. The work would continue. The appeals process would continue. Institutional resistance would continue, but the infrastructure needed to fight back was now in place and operational. Thank you, Daria, for everything. Thank you for trusting me with this, for letting me be a part of something important. After the meeting ended, August stood by the window watching the neighborhood's evening routines. Dog walkers, runners, families heading home. Though faces had changed and would change again, the same rhythms that had filled this street for decades remained. Somewhere within that ordinary flow of life, people were standing up against systemic failures. Discriminatory practices were being held accountable. People who had been fired, displaced, or harmed were finding the resources to fight back, not just because one woman refused to accept injustice, but because she had spent 40 years learning how to turn that refusal into something meaningful, how to document abuse, how to build cases that institutions couldn't ignore, and how to transform personal loss into structural change. Langston was good, loyal, and innocent. Her death was unjust, but her legacy, the fund, the reforms, the precedent, the garden where children will learn that dignity matters and accountability is possible, this legacy would outlast the grief. And finally, after being delayed for so long, this is what justice looked like when it finally arrived. Not perfect, not complete, but real, documented, and set in motion by someone who understood that without accountability, power would sooner or later have to face the consequences. August Hill had spent 40 years ensuring that the consequences were taken into account. Now Langston's name would ensure that these consequences were taken into account for future generations as well. He turned from the window and walked toward his lapel, running his fingers once more over the worn leather. "We did it," he whispered. "It's not enough. It will never be enough. But it's something. Outside, evening was giving way to night. The neighborhood had quieted down, and somewhere within the institutional mechanisms of change he had set in motion, justice, patient, methodical, unstoppable, continued to advance. Not revenge, just accountability. The kind of justice that makes those in power think twice before assuming oppression comes without a price. The kind of justice that turns a woman's pain, whose name they'll never know, but whose rejection they'll profit from, into a shield for others. The kind of justice that shows Langston's death, unjust though it was not meaningless. And for August Hill, who spent his life making decisions that shaped the lives of others, this was the only decision that mattered. Justice was served, finally, completely. With the full weight of 40 years of expertise behind it, and with the promise that this was only the beginning.